While holding my mixed-race baby for the first time, my brother pointed his finger at me. "I wonder where the dad is," he said, laughing. He didn't know my husband had died 4 months ago. He also didn't know that my father-in-law was standing in the doorway right behind him. My brother had only learned I was pregnant 2 weeks ago, and he'd been bombarding me ever since. Not because he wanted to meet his nephew, but because he wanted to make fun of me again. It's why I cut him off originally. He's always been obsessed with laughing at my expense, pushing me into puddles when we were little, or announcing to the whole class when I got my period for the first time. This was no different. When I locked eyes with my father-in-law, an ex-Navy SEAL in that hallway, while my brother was busy laughing about the baby being another statistic, I gave him the signal. You see, what my brother didn't know was that I had planned for this. I'd spent my entire last week coordinating with my late husband's family, my friends, even my brother's own wife, getting everything set in place. So while he stood there, laughing so hard his tears were rolling down my face, trying to get close and pinch my cesarean scar, his literal destruction was happening 20 feet away from him. I let him take his pictures, make his Facebook posts, write his captions about me being irresponsible and naive, because I knew that everything he did was just him unknowingly digging himself into a deeper and deeper hole. That's when a nurse came in, but not to check on me, but because even she was in on it. While leaning over to adjust my medications, she whispered to me that the guillotine was here, and asked if this meant it was go time. I nodded, and she turned around to set off the chain reaction. "Excuse me, sir," she told my brother. "Why were you recording her?" I knew my brother had no filter and prided himself on being brutally honest. So as expected, he started going off. Because my sister here decided to go black and never go back. What was she expecting? For a black man to override his instincts and become father of the year? I'm recording her to immortalize her stupidity. I pretended to act shocked, knowing this had started off exactly as planned. "How could you say that? You'd speak differently if you knew him and knew why he wasn't here," I yelled back, dropping him a breadcrumb to see if maybe he'd catch on to what was happening. But nope. My brother was the kind who needed to stomp on you in every argument, attack every insecurity, regardless of who was watching or how he said it. And I used that to my advantage. "If I knew him personally, I'd probably laugh even harder," he responded. "You've always been stupid and gullible. It's how I convinced you your money was missing, and convinced Mom you were the one stealing her opioid patches when she had cancer." There was something so satisfying about seeing him literally carve out his own destruction. He was already doomed by this point, but I planted one more question because I wanted to go overkill. "Are you just saying all of this because I have a child now and you're insecure about being infertile?" That's when he exploded. "How dare you? I'm saying it because this baby is a disgrace. If I wanted to have kids, I would. My wife does as I say. Our parents do as I say. My whole life I've gotten what I wanted, and that's never going to stop." This was going more perfect than I ever imagined. So perfect I actually started laughing. Of course, my brother saw this and got angry. "What's so funny?" he yelled. I didn't respond, just looked behind at the literal destruction waiting for him as soon as he turned around. It was even more grandiose than I'd imagined. "What's so funny?" he yelled again. I looked behind him again, this time obviously, and gestured for him to look as well. He whipped his head around, probably expecting a nurse or doctor, but instead he saw it. I've never seen someone's skin color actually change in real time. In front of him, he saw my father-in-law, our parents' lawyer, his own wife, his boss at work, and as the final cherry on top, he saw Cheryl, his intern and affair partner in one, who was black herself. He turned around back to me, and now I was the one recording him. He already had tears in his eyes, but before he could even plead, our father slapped him. He grabbed his cheek like he was actually shocked. He went to say something, but the lawyer pressed a document against his chest, cutting him off. "I'm removed from the will!" he screamed, reading it. "Not only that," his boss added, "you're fired too." My brother's mouth opened and closed repeatedly. "Add divorce to that list," his wife said, taking off her ring and making a show of throwing it at him. My brother was literally groveling on his knees by this point, and what he didn't know was that the biggest and final blow was yet to come. My father-in-law, who hadn't spoken a word yet, took out a pocket watch with a picture inside and handed it to my brother. That's Samuel," my brother said, crying by this point. "He was with me. He died in Iran 4 months ago." My father-in-law pointed at me. I watched the pieces in his head click. My late husband was his dead friend who he served with. That was my brother's breaking point. He lunged at me, but more importantly, he lunged at the baby. "I'm gonna kill you both, this is your fault." Then he did something I'll never forget. He spit directly in my face. The warm wetness hit my cheek, and I froze for half a second before my father-in-law moved faster than I'd ever seen a person move in real life. His hand clamped around my brother's wrist like a vice, stopping him inches from the baby's bassinet. My brother's other arm swung wild, and his elbow caught my stomach right where my incision was. The pain shot through me so sharp I couldn't breathe. The nurse, who I now knew was named Kylie from her badge, slammed her hand on a red button near my bed. An alarm started blaring, and within seconds, 2 security guards crashed through the door. My brother was screaming threats at me, actual death threats, while 5 grown men worked to hold him down. He kicked over the IV stand, and it clattered against the floor. His face was purple and twisted, and he kept yelling about how this was all my fault, how I'd ruined his life, how he was going to make sure I paid for it. The security guards got him in some kind of hold where his arms were pinned behind his back, but he was still thrashing. One of them radioed for backup. My father-in-law hadn't let go of his wrists the entire time, just stood there stone-faced while my brother struggled against all of them. A man in a different uniform pushed through the doorway and started barking orders. He pointed at my parents, at my brother's wife, at his boss, at Cheryl, at the lawyer. He told them all to leave immediately, that only medical staff could stay in the room. My mother tried to argue, but he cut her off and said this was hospital policy during a security incident. They dragged my brother toward the door and he was still screaming, still making threats. The man in charge turned to Kylie and told her to take the baby to the nursery for safety checks. My heart dropped into my stomach. She moved quickly, wheeling the bassinet toward the door before I could even process what was happening. I tried to sit up, but the pain in my incision made me gasp and fall back against the pillows. Kylie looked back at me with this expression that was both professional and sympathetic at the same time. She mouthed something that looked like he'll be okay before disappearing into the hallway with my son. The room felt huge and empty suddenly. The man who'd given all the orders came back in and introduced himself as Cameron Banks, head of hospital security. He asked if I was hurt, and I nodded, pressing my hand against my stomach where my brother's elbow had hit. Kylie was already there, gently moving my hand away and lifting my gown to check the incision site. Her face went serious when she looked at it. She told Cameron she needed to document everything and started taking photos with a hospital camera. She explained that hospital policy required police notification for any physical assault that happened on the premises. I was barely listening because all I could think about was my baby being somewhere else, away from me, with strangers. Cameron must have seen the panic on my face because he stepped closer and told me through the doorway that the nursery staff was keeping my son safe and monitored. He said they were just checking to make sure my brother hadn't hurt him during the lunge. Kylie was pressing carefully around my incision, and I could see blood seeping through the bandage. She said some of the stitches had pulled and there was increased bleeding. She needed to clean and redress it. Her hands were gentle, but everything hurt. She kept talking while she worked, maybe to distract me, explaining that the police were already on their way and that everything my brother had done was documented. She said the security cameras in the hallway had caught the whole thing. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe through the pain. When I opened them again, my father was standing in the doorway. He looked 20 years older than he had an hour ago. His shoulders were slumped and his face was gray. My mother appeared behind him, already talking, already making excuses. She said my brother had been under so much stress lately with the infertility issues and work problems. She said he didn't mean to actually hurt anyone, that he just lost control for a moment. The anger that went through me was so strong I thought I might throw up. I told her to leave. Just those 3 words. Leave. Now. Get out. My father surprised me by taking her arm and turning her toward the hallway. He didn't argue or try to convince me to listen to her. He just guided her away, and I heard her protesting as they walked down the hall. Kylie finished with my incision and disposed of the bloody gauze. She made notes on a tablet, documenting everything with timestamps. Cameron came back in and said the police had arrived and were taking statements from everyone who'd witnessed the incident. He asked if I felt safe enough to talk to them. I nodded even though I didn't feel safe at all. A woman in plain clothes walked in about 40 minutes after my brother had been removed. She showed me her badge and introduced herself as Laura Mendoza, a detective with the local police department. Her voice was calm and professional when she explained that my brother was being held for psychiatric evaluation before any charges could be filed. She said that given he'd threatened an infant in front of multiple witnesses, they needed to make sure he wasn't a danger to himself or others. She asked me basic questions about what had happened, taking notes on a small pad. I answered as clearly as I could, but my voice kept shaking. She told me I'd done nothing wrong and that threatening a baby was a serious crime. Then she left to continue gathering statements from the other witnesses. The minutes crawled by. I kept asking Kylie when I could see my baby, and she kept saying soon. They just needed to finish the checks. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably closer to 2, a different nurse wheeled the bassinet back into my room. I started crying before she even got close enough for me to reach him. She placed him carefully in my arms and told me he was completely fine. No injuries, all his vital signs normal. I held him against my chest and sobbed. All the adrenaline from the confrontation crashed out of me at once and I couldn't stop shaking. Kylie pulled up a chair and sat down, even though I could see from the clock that her shift had ended 30 minutes ago. She stayed quiet for a while, just sitting there while I cried and held my baby. Eventually, she told me quietly that she had a sister who'd cut off their abusive brother 5 years ago. She said she understood why I'd planned what I did. She said sometimes you have to force people to show their true nature in front of witnesses who can hold them accountable. My father-in-law appeared in the doorway, and Kylie excused herself, saying she'd check on me before she left for the night. He pulled up the chair she'd been sitting in, and we sat in silence for a long time. The baby had fallen asleep in my arms. Finally, he spoke and told me that Samuel would have done the same thing to protect his son. He said staging it in the hospital wasn't about revenge. It was about having witnesses and security when my brother inevitably lost control. He said I'd known my brother well enough to predict exactly how he'd react, and I'd made sure there were people there who could stop him before he actually hurt the baby. That made me feel slightly less guilty about the whole setup. He stayed until visiting hours ended, not saying much, just being present. The next morning, Detective Mendoza came back with a recording device and a formal statement form. She needed me to walk her through everything in detail for the official record. I started from the beginning, from childhood memories of my brother pushing me into puddles and announcing my first period to the whole class. I explained how I'd cut him off years ago because of his constant cruelty. I told her about the 2 weeks of cruel texts after he learned I was pregnant, about him calling my baby a statistic and making racist comments about Samuel. I showed her the texts on my phone and she photographed each one. I explained how I'd coordinated with my late husband's family, with my friends, with my brother's own wife, to get everyone in place. I told her I'd known he would lose control if he was confronted with the truth about Samuel in front of people who mattered to him. She listened without interrupting and took detailed notes. When I finished, she explained that my brother was being held on a 72-hour psychiatric hold after his threats. She said she was recommending charges for assault, criminal threatening, and violation of hospital conduct policies. She asked if I wanted to pursue a restraining order. I said yes immediately. She nodded and made another note. Then she told me she'd be in touch about the next steps in the legal process. After she left, a woman in professional clothes knocked on the doorframe. She introduced herself as Reina Contreras, a hospital social worker. She said she was there to discuss safety planning for when I got discharged. She pulled up a chair and opened a tablet. She helped me create what she called a contact tree, a list of people who could check on me regularly. We went through home security options and she gave me information about alarm systems and video doorbells. She asked careful questions about my mood, about whether I was sleeping, about whether I had thoughts of hurting myself or my baby. I answered honestly that I was scared and angry but not depressed or suicidal. She seemed satisfied with that and gave me a list of resources including a therapist who specialized in postpartum issues and trauma. She said given the circumstances, it would be good to have professional support lined up before I went home. After she left, I sat there feeding the baby when I heard a knock on the doorframe. My parents' lawyer stood there with his briefcase looking uncomfortable. He asked if he could come in and I nodded. He pulled up the chair and opened his briefcase, taking out a thick folder of documents. He told me he needed to clarify something about the will changes my father announced during the confrontation. I assumed he was there to explain the process or get signatures, but instead he slid a document across the table toward me. The filing date caught my eye immediately. 2 weeks ago, before my brother even came to the hospital. My father had already removed him from the will after I showed him the harassing texts about the baby. The hospital scene just made it public. The lawyer explained that my father wanted my brother to know in front of witnesses, so there could be no claims of coercion or impulsive decisions later. Everything had been notarized and filed properly before any of the confrontation happened. I stared at the paperwork and felt this weird mix of relief and something else I couldn't name. My father had believed me and protected me before I even asked him to. The lawyer left the documents with me and said to call if I had questions. My phone started buzzing before he even made it out of the room. I looked at the screen and saw my mother's name. I declined the call. She called again. And again. By the time I finished feeding the baby and got him settled in the bassinet, she had called 17 times. I finally answered on the 18th call because I knew she wouldn't stop. She was already crying before I said hello. She asked how I could do this to the family, how I could tear everyone apart like this, how she was supposed to choose between her children. I told her she didn't have to choose, that my brother made his choices when he spent a lifetime tormenting me, and then tried to hurt my newborn. She kept crying and saying I was being too harsh, that he was under stress, that he needed help, not punishment. I felt my jaw clench when she said he deserved one more chance. I asked her how many chances he got after pushing me into puddles, announcing my period to my whole class, stealing from me, framing me for stealing mom's cancer medication, and now threatening to kill my baby. She went quiet for a second, and then said, that was all in the past, and I needed to forgive. I told her I needed space to recover and bond with my baby, and I ended the call. She tried calling back twice more, but I turned my phone off completely. Detective Mendoza came by later that afternoon with an update. My brother had been released from the psychiatric hold that morning. The 72 hours were up, and the evaluators cleared him as not being an immediate danger to himself. He had conditions, though. No contact with me or my baby. Mandatory outpatient counseling. Regular check-ins with a probation officer. But what made my blood actually boil was when she told me about the paperwork his public defender filed. They were arguing that the lunge was emotional distress, not a genuine threat. That he was overwhelmed by learning about his friend's death, and reacted impulsively without real intent to harm anyone. Detective Mendoza saw my face and quickly added that the prosecutor wasn't buying it, that they had multiple witnesses who heard him scream about killing us both. She said the charges were moving forward regardless of what his lawyer claimed, but I couldn't stop thinking about how my brother was already trying to minimize what he did, already building a narrative where he was the victim of too much stress, instead of someone who tried to hurt a newborn. 4 days after the incident, the doctor cleared me for discharge. My father-in-law showed up that morning with his truck to drive us home. The nurse went through all the discharge instructions about incision care, watching for signs of infection, when to call if I had concerns. She handed me papers about postpartum warning signs and a prescription for pain medication. My father-in-law carried the baby in his car seat while I moved slowly toward the elevator, still sore from the C-section and the pulled stitches. The drive home felt surreal after everything that happened in that hospital room. When we got to my house, my father-in-law didn't just help me inside and leave. He walked through every room, checking windows and door locks. He asked if I had a spare key, and I showed him where I kept one under a fake rock by the back door. He picked it up and pocketed it, saying that was too obvious and he'd hold on to the spare himself. Then he went to his truck and came back with a video doorbell still in the box. He spent the next hour installing it and showing me how the app worked on my phone. He changed the locks on both doors while I sat on the couch feeding the baby. He didn't ask permission, just did it, and handed me the new keys when he finished. He programmed his number into my phone as an emergency contact and made me promise to call him if anything felt wrong or unsafe. 2 days after I got home, a thick envelope arrived by courier. It was from my brother's former employer, sent through their legal department. The letter explained that his termination was for violating company ethics policies, specifically racist conduct toward colleagues and an inappropriate workplace relationship with someone he supervised. The letter mentioned that an HR complaint had been filed 3 months earlier about his behavior. They had been investigating when the hospital incident happened, and that just accelerated their decision to terminate for cause. Reading it felt like watching puzzle pieces click into place. My brother hadn't just destroyed himself in that hospital room. He'd been building toward destruction for months, and the hospital was just where it all came crashing down at once. That same afternoon, I checked my email and found a message from Cheryl. The subject line just said, "Statement for your records," and I almost didn't open it. But I did. She had written out a detailed account of my brother's behavior at work over the past year. Racist comments about other colleagues, inappropriate jokes, the way he treated her differently after their affair started. She attached audio recordings of some of the comments, times when he didn't know she was recording during meetings. Her email ended by saying she was willing to provide everything to police if needed, but she didn't want to be personally involved beyond the written documentation. She said she had her own healing to do and didn't want to get dragged into legal proceedings if she could avoid it. I completely understood. She had already lost her internship because of my brother's behavior. I forwarded the email to Detective Mendoza with a note explaining the context. The next morning, my brother's wife texted me for the first time since the hospital. She asked if I could send her copies of the security footage and witness statements from that day. She was filing for divorce and needed documentation of his behavior. I didn't have the footage myself, but I forwarded her text to Detective Mendoza and asked how to handle the request. The detective called me back within an hour and said she would coordinate the evidence sharing through proper legal channels. She said my brother's wife had already filed a restraining order of her own, after he showed up drunk at her sister's house looking for her. Everything was documented and processed through the court system. 2 weeks after having the baby, I had to go to the courthouse for the first hearing on my temporary restraining order. My father-in-law picked us up and drove us there. He waited in the hallway outside the courtroom with the baby while I went in to testify. The judge asked me to explain why I needed the order. I started from childhood, from being pushed into puddles and having my period announced to my whole class. I talked about the years of harassment and mockery. I showed the court printed copies of the texts he sent after learning I was pregnant. I described what happened in the hospital, how he lunged at me and the baby while screaming threats. The judge listened without interrupting and took notes. My brother wasn't there, just his public defender who tried to argue that the hospital incident was an isolated event caused by emotional distress. The judge cut him off and said the pattern of behavior over decades made this clearly not isolated. She granted a 3-month temporary order and scheduled a full hearing for later to determine if it should be extended. I had my first postpartum checkup scheduled for that same afternoon. My father-in-law drove me straight from the courthouse to the doctor's office. I thought it would be routine, just checking that everything was healing properly. But when the doctor examined my incision site, her face got serious. She said the healing was slower than normal, probably because of the trauma and stress. She pressed gently on the area where my brother's elbow had caught me and I flinched. That's when I started crying. Just completely broke down on the exam table while the doctor held my hand. She let me cry for a few minutes and then gently said she wanted me to see a therapist who specialized in postpartum issues and trauma. She said what I went through wasn't normal postpartum stress. It was an actual traumatic event, on top of recovering from surgery and caring for a newborn. She gave me a referral and I scheduled an appointment for the following week before I could talk myself out of it. The next day, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it. The message said he was sorry, but I brought this on myself by choosing to have that baby. I knew immediately it was my brother. I took a screenshot before my hands even stopped shaking. Then I opened my messages to Detective Mendoza and sent her the screenshot with a note about the time and date. She responded within minutes saying she was adding it to the case file and documenting the violation of the no contact order. She said every violation made the case against him stronger and asked me to keep documenting anything else that happened. I saved her response and then blocked the unknown number, knowing he would probably just get another one. 2 days later, Cameron called while I was feeding the baby at 3 in the morning. He told me the hospital finished their review of everything that happened. Kylie got some coaching about keeping professional boundaries because she helped with my plan, but they didn't punish her since she hit the emergency button the second my brother went after the baby. I thanked him for letting me know and saved his number in case I ever needed to reference the hospital's findings for court stuff. The next afternoon, my father showed up at my door alone. I almost didn't let him in, but he stood on the porch looking older than I'd ever seen him and asked if we could talk. I opened the door, and he sat at my kitchen table while I kept the baby in my arms. He apologized for not protecting me from my brother when we were kids. He said he always thought it was just normal sibling stuff until he saw my brother try to hurt his grandson. He told me he was staying married to my mother but setting up separate boundaries, whatever that meant. Then he pulled out some paperwork, and explained he'd set up a trust fund for the baby that my brother could never touch or access. The account was already funded and had my father listed as trustee until the baby turned 18. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and he left after asking if he could visit again sometime. 3 days after that, someone knocked on my door around 10 in the morning. I checked the video doorbell my father-in-law installed and saw a woman in business clothes holding a clipboard. She introduced herself as a CPS worker doing a home visit because of the hospital incident report. My stomach dropped, but Raina had warned me this might happen, so I'd kept all my documentation organized in a folder by the door. I let her in and showed her the nursery, the stocked fridge, the medical supplies for my incision care, and all the baby's feeding and sleep logs I'd been keeping. She walked through each room, took notes, asked about my support system and whether I felt safe at home. I showed her the restraining order, the security system, and gave her Detective Mendoza's contact information. She spent maybe 40 minutes total in my house before telling me she was closing the case. She left me with a packet of community resources for new mothers and said I was doing everything right. I cried after she left, not from relief but from anger that I had to prove I was a good mother because my brother attacked us. That same week, I got a call from an unknown number that turned out to be someone from my brother's company's HR department. She explained they'd finished investigating and found he created a hostile work environment through racist comments about multiple coworkers. They also confirmed he had an inappropriate relationship with Cheryl while she was his intern, and he was her direct supervisor. The termination was ruled for cause, which meant he lost his severance package and couldn't claim unemployment benefits. She asked if I needed copies of their findings for any legal proceedings, and I said yes, so she emailed me a redacted report that same day. Detective Mendoza called 2 days later, sounding more serious than usual. She told me a patrol officer spotted my brother driving slowly down a street 2 blocks from my house. He didn't technically violate the restraining order since he stayed outside the restricted distance, but she wanted me to know. She said she was increasing patrol frequency in my neighborhood and told me to keep my security cameras running all the time. She also suggested I vary my routine and always check my surroundings when leaving the house. I felt my hands start shaking while she talked, and I had to put the baby down in his bassinet so I wouldn't drop him. My first therapy appointment happened the following Tuesday. My father-in-law watched the baby in the waiting room while I met with a woman who specialized in postpartum issues and trauma. She spent the first 30 minutes just screening me for postpartum depression and PTSD symptoms. I admitted I was having nightmares about my brother getting past my father-in-law and reaching the baby. I told her about checking the locks 5 times before bed and jumping at every car door I heard outside. She didn't seem surprised and said what I was experiencing made sense given what happened. We started working on some basic coping strategies for the intrusive thoughts and the constant need to check on the baby. She gave me homework about identifying my triggers and practicing breathing exercises when I felt the panic starting. I left feeling exhausted but slightly less alone. That night, my mother sent a long email with the subject line, Family Healing. She spent 6 paragraphs reframing the hospital incident as a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. She suggested we all go to mediation together so we could move past this and be a family again. She said my brother was suffering and needed support, not punishment. I read it twice and then closed my laptop without responding. 20 minutes later, my father sent me a separate text saying he told my mother that mediation wasn't happening and he supported whatever boundaries I needed. The next morning, my brother's wife texted me asking if I'd heard about her filing for divorce. She explained she was requesting temporary spousal support, exclusive use of their house, and her own restraining order after my brother showed up drunk at her sister's house looking for her. She said her lawyer thought having my testimony about his behavior would help her case. I sent her a supportive text back saying I was happy to be a reference for anything she needed and that I was proud of her for leaving. She responded with a thank you and said she'd been planning to leave for months, but the hospital incident finally gave her the courage. A week later, Gilbert Casey from the district attorney's office called to discuss my case. He explained my brother's lawyer wanted to avoid trial and was willing to accept a plea deal. The proposed terms included probation, mandatory counseling, and a long-term restraining order. He walked me through what each piece meant and asked how I felt about accepting a plea versus going to trial. I told him I needed time to think about it and he said that was fine. We had a few weeks before any decisions needed to be made. I spent my next therapy session talking through whether a plea deal felt like enough. Part of me wanted to see my brother face a jury and hear everything he'd done laid out in public. But my therapist asked what outcome would actually make me feel safe. And I realized a trial wouldn't change anything about my brother's behavior or attitude. She helped me understand that protecting my baby's safety mattered more than punishing my brother or getting validation from strangers in a courtroom. We talked about what justice really meant, and whether I needed my brother to suffer or just needed him to stay away from us. By the end of the session, my perspective had shifted from wanting revenge to wanting security, and I started thinking maybe the plea deal was the smarter choice. 2 days later, Cheryl sent me an email with the subject line, Update. She explained that her company decided to end her internship early because they didn't want any connection to the scandal involving my brother, even though she was the one he had treated badly. Reading her email made my stomach hurt because she had done nothing wrong except be the victim of my brother's awful behavior, and now she was losing opportunities because of it. I wrote back immediately offering to create a reference letter for her that focused on her work quality and professionalism, making it clear that she had handled an impossible situation with dignity. She responded within an hour thanking me and saying yes, she would really appreciate that. I spent the next morning writing the most detailed reference letter I could, describing her skills. and work ethic without mentioning my brother at all, and I sent it to her along with my contact information in case any future employers wanted to call me directly. She sent back a short thank you message, and I felt slightly less terrible about the whole situation, knowing I had at least tried to help fix some of the damage my brother caused. 6 weeks after having the baby, I had to go to the courthouse for the full restraining order hearing. My father-in-law watched the baby in the hallway because I didn't want to bring him into the courtroom, and I sat at a table with a victim advocate who explained what would happen during the hearing. When they brought my brother in, he sat across the room at another table with his public defender, and the whole time the judge was talking, my brother just stared at me with this look that made my skin crawl. The judge asked me to describe what happened at the hospital, so I walked through the whole incident starting from when my brother showed up and ending with him lunging at me and the baby. My brother's lawyer tried to argue that the lunge was just an emotional reaction and not a real threat, but then the prosecutor brought up the text my brother sent violating the temporary order, plus the incident where he showed up drunk at his wife's sister's house looking for her. The judge listened to everything, looked at my brother with clear disgust, and issued a 3-year protective order with terms that said my brother had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, my workplace, and anywhere he knew I would be. My brother's face turned red when the judge read out the terms, but he didn't say anything, just kept staring at me like he wanted to hurt me even more. 3 days after the hearing, I was home feeding the baby when someone knocked on my front door. I looked through the peephole and saw my mother standing there with a gift bag in her hands. I didn't open the door, just stood there watching her knock again and call my name. She started crying after the third knock, talking through the door about how I was keeping her grandson away from her, and how she just wanted to meet him and be part of his life. I unlocked the door but kept the chain on, opening it just enough to talk to her. I told her she made her choice when she defended my brother after he tried to hurt her grandson, and that choice meant she didn't get to have a relationship with either of us right now. She cried harder and said I was being cruel and unfair, that my brother was suffering and needed his family. I reminded her that my brother threatened to kill me and my baby in front of everyone, and that her response was to make excuses for him instead of protecting us. She tried to push the gift bag through the gap in the door, but I shut it completely and locked it, then stood there listening to her cry on my doorstep for another 5 minutes before she finally left. My next therapy session happened 2 days later, and I spent most of it talking about my mother showing up. My therapist asked how I felt about not letting her in, and I admitted that part of me felt guilty, but another part of me felt relieved that I had actually held my boundary. Then I said something I had been thinking about for weeks but hadn't wanted to say out loud. I told my therapist that part of me had enjoyed planning my brother's destruction at the hospital, watching him realize what was happening, seeing everything fall apart for him. I said I was scared that enjoying it made me just as cruel as him, that maybe I was no better than he was. My therapist was quiet for a minute, then asked me to think about the difference between what my brother did to me my whole life versus what I did at the hospital. She pointed out that my brother targeted me for entertainment, that he spent years finding ways to hurt and embarrass me because he thought it was funny. What I did was set up a situation where my brother would expose his true nature in front of people who could protect me and my baby, and where there would be witnesses and security when he inevitably got violent. She said protecting yourself and your child is not the same thing as targeting someone for fun, and that I needed to stop thinking of them as equal. That conversation changed something in my head, made me realize I could acknowledge that the hospital plan was complicated, without thinking I was as bad as my brother. The following week, Gilbert called to tell me they were revising the plea offer based on my brother's pattern of breaking the no-contact rules. The new terms included electronic monitoring where my brother would have to wear an ankle monitor, plus technology restrictions that meant he had to give up his phone, so they could install monitoring software on it. Gilbert explained that the restrictions would also ban my brother from creating any new social media accounts, and that violating any of these terms would send him straight to jail. He asked if I felt comfortable with the revised offer, or if I wanted to push for jail time right away. I told him I needed to think about it and talk to my therapist before deciding, and he said that was fine. I had a week to let him know what I wanted to do. That same afternoon, my father-in-law came over with a box of old photo albums. The baby was sleeping in his bassinet, and we sat on the couch looking through pictures of Samuel from when he was little, all the way through his military service. My father-in-law told me stories about each photo, like the time Samuel tried to build a treehouse when he was 8 and fell out of the tree, or the time he brought home a stray dog and convinced his parents to keep it. He showed me a picture of Samuel at his high school graduation, then another one from his Navy SEAL training, and his voice got quieter as he talked about how proud he was when Samuel completed the program. When we got to the wedding photos of me and Samuel, my father-in-law put his hand on my shoulder and said Samuel loved me more than anything, that he talked about me constantly when they spoke on the phone during deployments. That was when I started crying. Really crying. Not about my brother or the hospital or the legal stuff, but about losing Samuel and having to raise our son without him. My father-in-law held me while I cried, and it was the first time since the hospital that I let myself actually grieve my husband, instead of just being angry at my brother. After talking to both Gilbert and my therapist over the next few days, I decided to agree to the revised plea deal. Gilbert walked me through all the terms one more time to make sure I understood what they meant. My brother would get 18 months of probation with mandatory anger management classes and counseling sessions he had to attend every week. He would have to complete 200 hours of community service. The electronic monitoring meant he would wear an ankle bracelet that tracked his location at all times, and the technology restrictions meant his phone and computer would be monitored to make sure he wasn't trying to contact me or create fake accounts. The 3-year restraining order would stay in place, and if my brother violated any part of the agreement, he would go to jail immediately. Gilbert said he would file the paperwork and schedule the plea hearing, which would probably happen within the next 2 weeks. The plea hearing took place on a Tuesday morning at the courthouse. I had worked with my therapist to write a victim impact statement that focused on protecting my son and making sure we were safe, rather than describing every terrible thing my brother had done to me over the years. My therapist said the statement should be about what I needed going forward, not about making my brother feel bad about the past, because the past stuff would just upset me more when I read it out loud. At the hearing, my brother stood in front of the judge and pleaded guilty to assault and criminal threatening charges. The judge asked if he understood what he was pleading guilty to, and my brother said yes in this quiet voice that didn't sound like him at all. Then the judge asked if I wanted to read my victim impact statement, so I stood up and read what my therapist and I had written together. I talked about being a new mother trying to heal from a C-section and care for my newborn son, about the fear I felt when my brother threatened us, about needing to know that my son would be safe from violence as he grew up. I didn't mention the years of bullying or the cruel things my brother said at the hospital, just focused on the future and what needed to happen to protect us. The judge listened to my statement, then looked at my brother and accepted the plea agreement. She went through all the terms, the probation and counseling and community service and monitoring, then added her own warning at the end. She told my brother that if he violated any part of the agreement, even something small like missing a counseling session, he would be arrested immediately and face jail time. She said the court was giving him a chance to get help and change his behavior, but that chance came with zero tolerance for any more violations. My brother nodded and said he understood, but when his public defender started walking him out of the courtroom, he turned and looked directly at me with pure hatred in his eyes. That look told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't sorry. He didn't think he did anything wrong. He was just angry that he got caught and had to face consequences. The judge could order all the counseling in the world, but my brother would never actually understand why what he did was wrong or feel real guilt about it. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with 2 text messages that came in 1 minute apart. The first was from my mother. She wrote that she was disappointed in how I had handled this whole situation, that I had torn the family apart and made everything worse than it needed to be. She said she needed time before she could have a relationship with me, that she couldn't support the way I was treating my brother. I read it twice, felt a wave of sadness, then deleted it without responding. The second text was from my father. He wrote that he was sorry for how my mother was acting, that he understood why I needed the boundaries I had set. He said he would respect whatever I needed and give me space, but that he was available anytime if I wanted to have contact with him, and that he loved me and his grandson. I saved that text and wrote back a simple thank you, then put my phone down and focused on feeding the baby, trying not to think about how my family had broken into pieces that would probably never fit back together the same way again. A few days after the court hearing, my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from Kylie, asking how I was doing and saying she felt bad about the ethical gray area of participating in my plan. I wrote back thanking her for being there when things got dangerous, and told her I didn't regret having witnesses and security present when my brother showed who he really was. She responded with a heart emoji and told me to reach out if I ever needed anything. 3 months after the hospital incident, I got a text from my brother's wife with a PDF attachment showing her finalized divorce decree. She got the house and a temporary support order that would last until she finished her nursing degree. 6 months later, she sent me a photo of herself in a cap and gown at graduation, with a note thanking me for giving her the courage to leave. I saved that photo on my phone and looked at it whenever I felt guilty about how everything went down. When the baby turned 3 months old, I started back at work part-time with flexible hours and the option to work from home 3 days a week. My boss was understanding when I explained I needed security measures like not having my location published on the company website and keeping my desk away from the lobby where anyone could walk in. She moved me to an interior office near the back exit and told HR to keep my employee information private. Detective Mendoza called me a week after I returned to work to let me know she was closing the active investigation, but the case file would stay open for monitoring my brother's probation compliance. She gave me her direct cell number and told me to call immediately if he made any contact, or if I saw him anywhere near my home or workplace. I programmed her number into my favorites list and tested it once to make sure it worked. 2 weeks later, Gilbert called to tell me my brother got cited for a probation violation after his monitoring software showed he created a fake social media account under a different name. His probation officer recommended extended monitoring instead of jail time, which made me angry, but Gilbert explained that judges rarely revoke probation on first violations. I asked if this meant my brother would face any real consequences, and Gilbert said the violation would be documented and used against him if there were any future problems. A few days after that call, I texted my father and asked if he wanted to meet at a park halfway between our houses, so he could spend time with the baby. He showed up 15 minutes early with a new stroller he'd bought, and we sat on a bench while my son slept between us. My father didn't make excuses for my mother or my brother, just said he knew he'd failed to protect me growing up, and asked what I needed from him to feel safe having him in his grandson's life. I told him I needed him to respect my boundaries about my mother and my brother, to never pressure me to reconcile or forgive, and to leave immediately if I ever asked him to. He agreed to all of it and asked if he could visit once a week. During one of my therapy sessions around this time, I had a breakthrough when I admitted I'd been using anger at my brother to avoid dealing with the pain of losing Samuel. My therapist helped me see that being consumed by the legal situation and the family drama let me focus on something I could control instead of grieving properly for my husband. We started working on exercises to help me process the grief without feeling like I was dishonoring Samuel's memory by moving forward with my life. On the baby's 4-month birthday, a card arrived in the mail from my mother with a check for $500 and a note saying she was trying to understand my perspective. I didn't cash the check, but I did send her a text thanking her for the card, which felt like a tiny step without giving up my boundaries. That same week, I got a LinkedIn message from Cheryl saying she'd been hired at a better company with a significant pay raise and thanking me for the reference letter I'd written months ago. She said standing up to my brother and his behavior was scary, but it helped her recognize her own worth and demand better treatment in her career. I was glad something good came out of the whole mess for her. The following Saturday, my father-in-law came over with a bag full of security equipment and spent the entire day installing cameras that covered all the entrances and motion sensors in the yard. We didn't talk about my brother specifically, just worked together on the practical safety measures while he told me stories about Samuel's childhood and their relationship. He showed me how to check the camera feeds on my phone and set up alerts for any motion detected after dark. By the time he left that evening, I felt safer in my house than I had since the hospital incident. The next week, Raina called to remind me about the support group she'd mentioned, and I actually went. The meeting happened in a church basement with folding chairs arranged in a circle, and there were about 12 other women there with babies or small kids. I sat in the back holding my son while a woman named Jennifer talked about how her parents disowned her when she got pregnant at 19. Another woman shared about her sister who refused to meet her daughter because of some old family fight. When it was my turn, I kept it simple and just said my brother attacked me in the hospital, and now we don't talk. And 3 different women nodded like they understood exactly what I meant. After the meeting, 2 of them came up and gave me their phone numbers, saying they also had family members they'd cut off, and it helped to talk to people who got it. One of them told me her strategy for handling holidays was planning them early with friends instead of waiting for family invitations that would never come, which actually seemed really smart. I left feeling less alone than I had in months, like maybe other people understood what it was like to protect your kid from your own family. A few days later, Gilbert called with an update about my brother's anger management course. He'd finished all 12 sessions like the court ordered, but his counselor wrote in the final report that he showed minimal engagement and lack of genuine insight into harmful behaviors. I asked Gilbert if that meant anything would change, and he explained that judges rarely cared much about counselor opinions on court-ordered programs. The important thing was that my brother completed it, and the monitoring was still active. Gilbert also mentioned that the counselor's notes would be useful if my brother ever tried to get the restraining order lifted early, since they showed he hadn't actually changed his thinking patterns. That same week, I had a therapy session where I finally admitted something I'd been avoiding. I told my therapist that planning the whole hospital confrontation felt necessary to protect my son, but I also knew it was kind of messed up to stage a dramatic scene like that. She asked me what I thought would have happened if I hadn't planned it, and I realized my brother probably would have shown up anyway and said horrible things, but without witnesses or security nearby. My therapist said I could feel proud of protecting my son, while also recognizing I'd staged something manipulative in a hospital, and both things could be true at the same time. She helped me understand that protecting yourself doesn't have to be perfect or completely ethical to still be the right choice in a dangerous situation. My father started coming by every Saturday morning after that conversation. He'd bring coffee and a bag of groceries, then spend a few hours playing with the baby or fixing small things around my house that I hadn't gotten to. He replaced a broken cabinet hinge, tightened the wobbly bathroom faucet, and installed better locks on my bedroom windows without me even asking. What I appreciated most was that he never brought up my mother or suggested I should give my brother another chance. When I needed to talk, he listened, and when I needed quiet, he just focused on his grandson or whatever project he was working on. He respected when I asked him to leave because I was tired or overwhelmed, and he never made me feel guilty about setting boundaries with him. One afternoon while he was there, a patrol car pulled up outside and an officer knocked on my door. My stomach dropped thinking something had happened, but the officer just wanted to let me know they'd spotted my brother driving slowly past my street the night before. He explained they'd pulled my brother over for a welfare check, and he wasn't technically violating the restraining order since he never stopped or got out of his car. The officer added the incident to the monitoring file anyway, and told my brother it looked like stalking behavior, which could get him in real trouble if it happened again. I thanked the officer and immediately called Gilbert to report it, even though technically nothing illegal had occurred. 2 weeks later, there was a hearing about extending my brother's electronic monitoring. His lawyer argued that 6 more months was excessive since he'd completed his anger management and hadn't directly violated any orders. But the prosecutor brought up the slow drive past my street and the fake social media account he'd created, showing the judge a pattern of boundary-pushing behaviors. The judge agreed and extended the monitoring for another 6 months, saying my brother clearly wasn't taking the restrictions seriously enough. I didn't attend the hearing because Gilbert said I didn't need to be there, but he called me right after to tell me the outcome. That weekend, I took the baby to visit Samuel's grave for the first time since the funeral. I'd been avoiding it because I didn't know what to say or how to handle taking a baby to a cemetery, but I finally felt ready. I sat on the grass next to his headstone with my son in my lap, and just talked out loud about everything that had happened. I told Samuel about our son's personality, how he smiled when I sang to him, and how he had Samuel's exact same eyebrows. I told him about standing up to my brother, about the hospital confrontation, about trying to build the safe life we'd planned together even though he wasn't there to share it. I told him I was scared sometimes that I was doing everything wrong, but I was trying my best to raise our son the way we'd talked about. My therapy sessions started shifting around that time from crisis management to long-term healing. Instead of processing immediate threats and safety concerns, we worked on building positive daily routines and coping strategies for when I felt overwhelmed. I was sleeping better most nights, only waking up twice to feed the baby instead of lying awake worrying about my brother showing up. The intrusive thoughts about worst-case scenarios were less frequent, maybe once or twice a week instead of constantly. I started thinking about my future beyond just surviving each day and protecting my baby from immediate threats, actually considering things like going back to work, or maybe taking a class. Detective Mendoza sent me a final case summary in the mail showing my brother had 9 months of probation remaining with continued monitoring. She included a note reminding me the restraining order was valid for another 2 years, and gave me updated contact information for the Victim Advocacy Office if I needed support. She also wrote that I should call her directly if anything concerning happened, even if it seemed minor, because patterns mattered more than individual incidents. I filed the papers in a folder I kept specifically for legal documents related to my brother, which was getting pretty thick by that point. Early one morning when the baby was almost 6 months old, I was sitting on my front porch at dawn with him in my arms, watching the neighborhood wake up. My neighbor across the street was getting his newspaper, and the woman 2 houses down was leaving for her morning jog. The security cameras my father-in-law installed were recording everything, and my phone was right next to me with emergency contacts programmed in. I realized sitting there that I felt genuinely safe for the first time since Samuel died. My brother faced real consequences that would last for years. My boundaries with my family were clear and enforced, and my son was healthy and loved by people who actually cared about protecting him. It wasn't a perfect ending where everything got fixed and everyone reconciled, but it was a stable one where we were both protected and moving forward together, and that felt like enough. And that's the end of this story. I'm so glad you joined me, because it makes telling these feel meaningful. Hopefully it brought some light to your day. Subscribe so we can do it again soon.